Kamen Rider, Kamen Rider, Rider.
Well, I ended the last part with the first ever Rider film, so let's continue on this train of historical importance. Project G4 is the first ever Heisei film for Rider, if you don't count the trilogy of Shin, Zeto, and J, and well, it isn't that good. Well, it's not terrible either, you'll see what I mean later. Also, I'll be giving off a short summary of the film so you guys aren't lost from the get-go. Alright, after an attack on a facility that hones psychics, a pair of survivors, Sayaka and Rei, are found by Shuichi as Risa from the JSDF creates Kamen Rider G4. Risa and the user of G4, Shiro, tries to capture the two psychics in order to make the G4 system even stronger. Eventually, they discover that Mana has even more powerful psychic abilities, leading to them capturing her, which ultimately culminates in a climactic fight resulting in Shiro and Risa's deaths. Now, this may shock some people, but I actually consider Risa to be the best part about this film. Yes, she's a complete bitch who's the typical mad scientist that's completely fine with sacrificing others because everything is for the safety of my country? That's a weird motivation, but honestly, I think her bitchiness is what made her so enjoyable. The actress of Risa, Maju Ozawa, did an incredible job making Risa such a hateable character. However, I will note that I thought Risa could have been more unique, as there really isn't much special about her since her entire character was pretty cliched. Well, if the side villain was so good, what about the main one? No, he sucks. Sure, Shiro had an interesting philosophy where he believed that only those who throw away their desire to live can truly become strong, but that's really all there is to him. His philosophy is literally the only defining trait about his character. However, his philosophy did bring up some good contrast with Ikawa, who was probably the second best thing in this film behind Risa. Sure, even he did little aside from being a foil to Shiro's ideals, but he was the only one who actually felt like his character from the TV series. Everyone else, mainly Shoichi, Mana, and Ryo, really just felt like watered down versions of their TV counterparts. Plus, Hikawa and Shiro's clash resulted in probably one of the best fights in the franchise. But now, it's time to talk about the bad. First up, Sayaka and Rei. While yes, they developed as characters, with Sayaka learning to be happy and Rei learning to not rely on his powers all the time, but in the grand scheme of things, they were completely pointless to the narrative, which just makes the scenes we spend with them feel like a complete waste of time. And speaking of complete waste of time, the plot. Yeah, this film is slow and padded to all hell. The first 40 minutes of the film do not have any plot significance other than introducing G4. They added a lot of subplots and artistic choices that really just drag things out. The initial attack on the psychic facility seems like it would play a role, but other than cause Shiro's philosophy to emerge and explain how Rei and Sayaka would come to meet Shoichi, who are both useless in the film, it really never even comes up again. There's a new viral trend about an ESP test that turns out is being used by the unknowns to kill potential Akitos, which never really gets brought up again, and a bunch of artsy shots involving a piano and some spinning picture thing. Yeah, I know it invokes symbolism or something, but honestly, all it's doing is wasting time since they like to drag those scenes on for a long time. Overall, this film wasn't bad, but it's pretty slow. Hikawa was the only notable protagonist, the side characters were pretty pointless, and the plot didn't really have much substance. Though like I said, Risa was an enjoyable character to hate, and Shiro had an interesting philosophy, but both of these characters were ultimately bland. Well, if you like Build, you probably won't like to hear this next part. Yeah, Be the One was a huge letdown. There are two big issues I have with this movie, but first, summary time. 3 members from the Blood Clan, Kengo, Mitsuomi, and Ryoka, have come to Earth and brainwashed everyone to hate Sento. They then brainwash Ryuga and use his powers and the Pandora's box to try and destroy the Earth, but Sento manages to free Ryuga and together, they manage to stop Kengo and the others' plan. Now, the good stuff really does come from how this movie highlights the bond between Sento and Ryuga, and how it tries to develop Sento, with him wanting to continue fighting for everyone, even if they don't acknowledge or respect him for it. Plus, the plot does move at a reasonable pace, and doesn't ever really feel like it drags on. Okay, now the bad. The villains were honestly pretty weak. They're from the same planet as the Volto, and they want to destroy Earth because they're omnicidal maniacs. Boring. But now, it's time to discuss the 2 big problems this movie has. Its development for Sento, and the numerous retcons this movie makes. I know I praised how this movie tried to develop Sento, but my issue is that it's repetitive. This film once again tells the audience how much Sento and Ryuga changed each other for the better and stuff, but come on, this is like the 3rd time the show accentuates this bond. And the whole Sento warning to fight for others not for recognition or thanks was already covered since he told Ryuga all the way back in episode 3 that he fought to save people for the sake of saving them. But the biggest issue I have with his development is that it once again pulls Sento in a depressive spiral because he was actually being used as a pawn. Yeah, it turns out that Kengo was the one who decided to give Takumi the identity of Sento Kiryu and pretty much orchestrated most of the events that occurred in the series, which causes him to be sad. This happened when he learned about his past about being Takumi. This happened when he learns about Shoichi telling him to become Build to become a quote-unquote hero of justice. This happened when Gontoku berated Sento/Takumi for creating the hazard trigger knowing it could only be useful for war. This happened when he found out that the Build Driver was just a tool for Revolto to reach his final form. This happened when Shinobu was revealed to be working with the Revolto and that the Build Driver wasn't intended for justice. Stop pulling this shit. Yeah, this is an issue I have with Build, but it's like the only goddamn thing I can think of to challenge Sento as a character is him finding out some aspect of his life was being used as a tool/pawn for others. And the thing about the revelation in this film is that he should already know this stuff. He knows that Revolto gave him a fake identity and role as a hero. He knows that the Build Driver was intended to be used for destruction, yet we've constantly seen him overcome these issues. Why is it that finding out that it was actually Kengo, not Revolto, that sends him into another depressive spiral? Plus, it always resolves the same fucking way. Even if others plan to use him and his devices as tools for war and evil, he'll use them for justice instead. On to the second issue now. This film made a really dumb choice by making Kengo and the others the big masterminds of the entirety of Build instead of it being just Revolto. I know I mentioned that Kengo was the one who created the identity of Sento Kiryu, but you know what else they did? They were the reason why Sento and Riga met up in the first place, and they were the ones who planned for Katsumi to turn into a smash so Riga's hazard level would be boosted. The issue is that this makes no sense in the context of the overall narrative of Build and takes away from Revolto's aura of menace. Revolto had a legitimate reason for wanting Sento and Ryuga to raise their hazard levels, Sento to continue refining the perfect weapon suitable for his true form plus the fact he was actually Takumi, and Ryuga to regain the rest of his body. But why in the world did Kengo and the others care so much about Sento and Ryuga that they were content with controlling their lives for a couple of years? Plus, the entire reason why Kengo and the others betrayed Revolto in this film was because they realized he wasn't planning on destroying Earth. So why did you guys decide to mess with Sento and Riga for around a decade instead of destroying the world as soon as possible? Oh sure, it's because both of them would help with the destruction of the world. But that contradicts with them controlling Ryuga's life. Remember, Ryuga was only important because he had part of Revolto inside of him. He would have served no purpose to Kengo and the others. Now, Sento was important because his role as a hero helped purify the bottles, but Ryuga? He was literally a nobody to Kengo. There are also a lot of plot holes and logical gaps when you start to think about things. Shinobu somehow knows that the light from the Pandora's box turned people evil, despite the sky wall rising only seconds before that statement was made, and he would have no way of knowing that information. Kengo and the others' arrival on Earth is baffling, given the fact that they somehow possess the other astronauts that arrived on Mars, which means that either they were also in the Pandora's box when Shoichi touched it, which is improbable since in all the footage we've seen, Revolto was the only one who came to Mars, nor does Vernage mention the existence of the other three Blood Clan members, or the astronauts were always from the Blood Clan in the first place, which is also highly unlikely. The hazard trigger plus Pandora's box just causes the Earth's destruction in this scenario, but later on, it instead creates the white panel because... plot bullshit, I guess. Alright. I know I've ranted about this movie for a long time, and you'd think that it should fall lower than this, but honestly, the movie itself is fine. It's only when you start to apply this film to the bigger narrative of Build is when the problems start to arrive. I still like Sento in this film, and the plot and pacing were fine. Hopefully this is the last time I make a rant this long. Okay, no long rant this time, I promise. Kamen Rider V3 the movie is the theatrical version of V3's second episode. Why it's only the second episode and not both the first and second episode is confusing, but whatever. Anyways, this film had some good moments. I like the scene where Shiro grieved over his family and the following talk between Shiro and Junko. It really helps hit home the emotional grief that Shiro's feeling and lets us know more about him as a character. Unfortunately, the film really doesn't delve any deeper than that, which is a shame, since they definitely had the perfect situation to reveal more about Shiro as a character. At least the plot was decent. Yeah, everyone talks about the ending with the double rider seemingly sacrificing themselves, but everything before that was pretty generic. Hell, the heroes only stop the plane because the monster of the week tells it to them for no reason. Plus, the film not adapting the first episode really does hurt its ranking, since if you look at it as a standalone movie rather than an episode in a series, you really don't fully understand Shiro's grief or his backstory. Oh well, for what this film is, it's honestly quite good. Oh god. Well, after looking at V3's second episode, it's time to look at the final episode. Get it? Final episode? Like as in episode final? God, someone kill me for that joke. It didn't even make sense. Well, I don't really need a plot summary of this film, it's basically just an alternate ending to the Rider fight. So yeah, what did I like about this film? Well, Miho mainly. Yeah, she was a pretty decent character. She wanted revenge against Asakura for killing her sister, and is also a con artist because she needs the money to keep preserving her dead sister's body. Yeah, that's creepy as fuck. Weird how the film never brings up that odd element of hers again after that scene, but that's probably for the better. Unfortunately, while I did like her backstory, I honestly didn't really feel like she had any charm to her, so she wasn't really that memorable in my opinion. However, she is still arguably the best part about this film, so... With the other characters, I didn't really like them. Both Asakura and Kitauka got killed off unceremoniously, with neither of them leaving that much impact on the story. Ren barely did anything until the very end, where he had a nice scene with Shinji which highlighted their relationship. Shinji himself? Yeah, I didn't really like him. He was the same naive, gullible fool as he always was for the entire film. Now, there's one character, technically two, but we'll talk about him later, that I haven't talked about yet, and you can probably guess why. Yui. Yeah, this film drops a bunch of exposition about her backstory, the purpose of the Rider fight, and more. Unlike the main universe, this universe's Yui died after staying in the Mirror World for too long as a child, but her Mirror World counterpart extended her life until her 20th birthday. While it was nice learning more about Yui, it didn't actually make her character more memorable. She kind of felt like a plot device rather than an actually enjoyable and intriguing character. Speaking of the plot, it's also kind of boring. Like Project G4, this movie does suffer from lots of padding and slow pacing. However, unlike Project G4, there are some additional plot issues that are a bit more substantial. So for one, how did Shiro know about Yui's condition, since he left for America before Yui went to visit the Mirror World? Second, it turns out that the wish isn't actually a wish, but rather only able to grant new life. Which then calls into question why in the world people like Asakura, Masashi, and Jun would even join the Rider fight, since the reasoning for joining the fight wasn't even tied to reviving someone. Plus, for some reason, Shiro needs to revive Yui before she dies for real, even though the wish shouldn't be dependent on whether Yui's dead or alive for her to be revived. Kitauka is able to quit the Rider fight, with no consequences, and Shinji, for some inexplicable reason, decides to listen to Dark Shinji and fuses with him. Shinji, why are you that stupid? Oh yeah, Dark Shinji, forgot to mention him. Yeah, he's the other character that has a lot of issues. He's the Mirror World version of Shinji that appears out of nowhere, and all he wants is power, and that's about it. Yeah, like Issei, he's a contender for worst Rider movie villain. Getting back on topic, the reason why this film felt so slow was mainly due to the big subplot of this movie, the relationship between Miho and Shinji. Yeah, sure, it led to some nice scenes between the two, but it just felt ultimately pointless, since none of the character grew or developed because of it. Sure, you can say that the relationship does bring out the more honest and good person within Miho, but unfortunately, we never get to see that before she's killed off. Hell, Shinji never even found out that Miho died, so what was the entire point? Just to waste enough time until the final battle? And speaking of the ending, for being the quote-unquote final chapter of the TV series, it ends on a massive cliffhanger. Final chapter my ass. However, the movie itself did have a nice story, with some good emotional moments that stuck with me. Plus, the story it tells is nice, as long as you don't think about it too much and start to find the issues it has. Why do I keep ranting so much? These movies are rated 4 out of 10. I should be giving them more praise. Well, take my word that despite all my ranting, this movie isn't that bad. Damn, am I really going to anger the Build fanbase again? I think I am. Yes, surprisingly, it's not New World Cross, but rather New World Greece. It's kind of a basic plot, with Kazumi stopping a new evil organization. Anyways, the plot of this film was pretty good, and seeing the build cast in general was great. Plus, the emotional moments of the film were quite good, even if some of them felt repetitive, namely pulling off the whole "the three crows are dead again." Even the story didn't really have that many egregious issues. Yes, there were the minor ones, such as other governments knowing of the Kamen Riders despite Sentro/Takumi spending the entire series not wanting the governments to have it, or the fact that literally no one tries to remove the hazard trigger from Keiji, but the biggest issue was only at the very end. So, it turns out that Sento basically lied to Kazumi by telling him that the three crows died again, also that Kazumi would undergo enough mental torment that his hazard level would rise enough to use the power-up. And nobody comments on how fucked up this is? Hell, that entire scene is just treated as a joke, with Kazumi comically cursing Sento. Other than that, the story isn't bad, and there aren't that many issues, so what makes it land here? Well, it's mainly the characters and the villains. Kazumi really doesn't develop or change that much. He got depressed because he got rejected by Misora, but then he eventually gets out of that. Though he apparently gets so depressed that he doesn't even care about her, even with the threat of her being kidnapped. Like, what the fuck? But the worst part has got to be the villains. Simon is the leader of the big bad organization, Downfall. He wants to take over the world, and that's it. Yeah, he's bad, but at least he's killed off by the middle of the movie. Too bad his replacement is even worse. Keiji is probably the worst Build movie villain. He has no personality, no emotions, and the motivation behind his plan was actually stupid. He actually had a reasonable motivation for basically wanting to send the world into chaos, a hatred for humanity born out of betrayal and torture. But instead, the film reveals he's actually doing this because no one appreciated my talents back in the old world, so I'll prove my talents are superior by setting the world on fire. Yeah, standard stuff. Overall, New World Grease is a good story that has some small hiccups. While it did backslide on some of the characters, at least it wasn't a major backslide. However, its lack of focus on any of the core characters, especially Kazumi, a repetition of the majority of the emotional beats from the TV series, some weird story elements that made the film awkward, and one awful villain really dragged this movie down. It's really only saved by seeing the Veiled Cast all together and the final fight scene with Perfect Kingdom. Well, I don't know how much I can say about this film. Oh's Wonderful is an average movie that has some bad things about it. That's really all my thoughts about it, but I'll try my best to expand on them. This film kind of felt like a regular episode of Rider. Gaara, an ancient alchemist, is somehow revived and he plans on destroying the world and rebuilding it as its ruler. Eiji and Ankh are forced to stop and blah blah blah, they win, everyone sings and dances. Eiji and Ankh were alright in this film, nothing too atrocious happened. Yeah, they had good moments, but that's all they really were, moments. They didn't really develop because of them. Sure, we see Eiji show he cares about everyone and that Ankh begins to trust Eiji more, but the former is something we already know, and the latter is ruined by how wishy-washy Eiji and Ankh's relationship is for the rest of the series. The side characters are just there to fulfill their roles as extra characters we're supposed to care about, and also to corroborate the theme of connecting without words. We mainly focus on a kid named Shun, who believes that his mother hates him, but by the end of the movie, he reconnects with his mother. Oh yeah, Date's in this movie. Too bad he doesn't do anything important. Now, the story is fine, there aren't any major plot holes or unexplained things, with the only ones really being connected to Gaara. Speaking of Gaara, he's terrible. Like I said, he's an ancient alchemist who comes back in the present time by taking over the body of Shun's mother. It also turns out he's one of the original alchemists who created the core metals, and that's as far as that subject goes. His motivation for wanting to destroy then rebuild the world is that he wants to achieve what the original O's couldn't do. Something about being the true O's or being worthy for the name, I don't really remember. His motivation is bad enough, but combined with his non-existent characterization and that his power set is completely bullshit, seriously, how does being an alchemist mean you're able to control time and space? He just drags this movie down, though not by much. So yeah, that's really all I've got to say about this film. The plot's fine, the characters weren't bad, but they really didn't do much or grow, and the villain was bland and boring. Drive Savamak had the potential to develop Go in a meaningful way, but unfortunately it failed to capitalize on that opportunity. This movie doesn't feel like a movie focused on Go, but rather a regular episode of Drive with just a slightly bigger budget. However, the main plot isn't anything fancy or special, it's just a love story between Go and Reiko, which is pretty disappointing. Yeah, that plot is the main reason why this movie is below average. The only expansion Go gets is getting the courage to confess his true feelings, and Reiko's expansion is just being freed from the shackles of her father. Sure, I liked her development and her relationship with Go, I just wish it wasn't in a movie that was focused on Go. And the villain of the film is Roidmead005, who copied Reiko's father, the corrupt killer Koya. Yeah, that's the only reason why he's evil. So yeah, while the relationship between Go and Reiko did help to keep the movie going and also slightly develop these characters a bit more, the fact that this was the main focus of the film really just disappoints me. 005 is bland, and I wish that the film just had a story focused on Go alone. Man, another short section. Yeah, it's kinda hard for me to talk about some movies I find average. Not really much else I can say other than, it's just okay. Well, another film focused on a vehicle-themed secondary. Yeah, Double Returns Axel is also just below average. While this is basically just a movie about Ryu dealing with the Dopant case, it's the other subplot of this film that drags it down. The whole Akiko and Ryu marriage problem plot. Don't get me wrong, Ryu was a badass through and through in this film, but it's Akiko I feel like got the short ends of the stick. I get it. The writer probably wanted to focus on Ryu and Akiko's relationship for the film since it was mainly just in the background in the TV series, but did they really have to focus on it in such a way that made both characters, especially Akiko, extremely stupid? In summary, the problem arises because Akiko believes Ryu doesn't love her because he doesn't call her Akiko, but rather Chief, which is made worse when Akiko believes Ryu has fallen for the client of their case instead because they're spending so much time together. Ugh. Yeah, this might not be a very common opinion, but I don't find Akiko that annoying of a character. Yes, sure, she caused problems in the beginning of Double, but she did grow out of those, as seen in the arc where she learns what it means to be a true detective. But to see her in this film, where she's reverted to a paranoid and selfish mess that doesn't really care about the problems she causes others, makes me really disappointed. She should know that Ryu will do anything for his clients because, you know, that's a philosophy shared by him, Shotaro, Philip, and her own father. Hell, she even believes in the same philosophy of doing anything to save a client, as shown at the end of the Sweet Still Plant arc. Speaking of the client, her name's Aoi. She's a pickpocket that hates cops because one of them shot her father, who was also a criminal, despite him already surrendering. Other than that, she's really just there to exist as the reason why Akiko and Ryu are bickering. Sure, her development does tie into the film's themes of anyone can change, since she eventually trusts in the police and swears off a life of crime, but neither Akiko and Ryu were really connected to that theme in the first place, so the whole subplot seems out of place. Also, the cop that killed her father turns out was the villain of this film, Hiroshi Sagami. He's a decent villain. He hates all criminals since one of the criminals he arrested got revenge by killing his wife. This tragedy, alongside the corruption brought by the Gaia memories, drives him to kill all criminals, believing they can only be saved through death. One problem though. This is the exact same thing as the Triceratops Dopant. You know, a Dopant who was also a police officer who wanted to get revenge on criminals for killing a person close to them, eventually succumbing to the Gaia memories corruption and was forced to be stopped. Overall, while this film's quality can be described as generically decent, it was brought down by the whole Akiko and Ryu bickering that lasted the entire film. Plus, Akiko basically backsliding in her development for this film just so they could develop her back into the character she was kinda stupid. Otherwise though, everything else was decent. The story was fine, if not a little bland. Ryu was a complete badass, though I find he really didn't get much in terms of expansion. Hiroshi was an okay villain, only really brought down by the fact we've already seen a villain exactly like him in Double, and Aoi actually felt like a character instead of some random muck whose only purpose is to push the film along. Too bad she's the reason why the worst part of this film exists. You know, it's surprising how forgettable this film is.
出口のない答えを求め
Yeah, even though this film is pretty high up, I'll be honest and say that I completely forgot the true ending even existed. It's not like it was bad or anything, but it was extremely bland, and you can see where my problems lie with this film. The main cast are all fine in this film, but honestly, there really isn't much to them. Emu's the guy that gives hope to everyone, Hiro's the cold guy, Taiga's the jerk, Kiria's relaxed, Kuroto's deranged, Poppy's there for sport, etc, etc, etc. Honestly, it's like the film tried to make these characters as bare bones as possible while still resembling their TV counterparts. Well, at least no one backslided on their development. Even the villains aren't spared from being bare bones as all hell. Kamen Rider Fuma, or Kaganari, is a man who just cares about making his daughter happy, even if it means making her live a lie in a VR world. Then he realizes what he's doing is wrong, and he decides to reform himself. That's it. Johnny Maxima is even worse, once again just being a CEO with a god complex, but without any depth or complexities to him. Now, the overall story and flow is fine. Sure, there is a bit of a weird disconnect when looking at the first half of the film compared to the second half, but it doesn't drag the film down that much. No, my problems lie with how much unexplained stuff there is, which specifically lies with the villains and the main side character, Madoka. Oh, before I go on to the unexplained issues, Madoka herself is another issue. She's a terminally ill girl who is the center of the VR world that Kakunari and Johnny's created. She seemingly hates reality, which is why she decides to stay in the VR world even while it's being destroyed. However, the true reason why she wants to stay in the VR world is because she knew that would make her father happy, which is Kaganari. Yeah, bull fucking shit. Are you telling me that this girl who hasn't seen her father since she was probably a baby knew that the one who put her into the VR world was her father and that he did all of this for her? Sure, they brushed this off by stating that Madoka only stayed in the VR world because she knew it would make someone happy, but not exactly sure who, but that sounds even worse. I'm not sure if I would be happy being kidnapped because it would make someone else happy. Also, her characterization is non-existent and she only exists to push the plot of the movie forward. Okay, back to the unexplained stuff. So, we know that Kaganari is Madoka's father, but why he left her in the first place is never explained. Why he went to work with Johnny is also never explained. Why did the powers of 3 random Gasha trophies that came from the game world Madoka was trapped in grant the power of Gamduas to Johnny? Say it with me now, never explained. There are more story issues I've got, but they're pretty minor in the grand scheme of things, so I won't bother talking about them. Still, you can probably see where I come from with this film. All the protagonists are bland and bare bones, the villains are one note with a lot of unexplained details that drag them down, and Madoka was a side character that just confused me. Though like I said, the overall story and pace is fine, which is why this film is only below average. Still though, this is honestly probably one of the most forgettable Kamen Rider films. It's another Drive film. Well, you can probably guess this one. Yeah, Drive Saga Heart also isn't that great. Don't get me wrong, it's decent, but well, there could have been a lot more. I like the focus on Heart, but did he really have to share the screen time with Medic and Brain? I mean, yeah, I enjoyed seeing them all interact, but they didn't really do much other than provide comedy. Hell, I find it odd that both Brain and Medic now love humanity in this film. Sure, the final arc saw the three team up with Shinosuke and the others, but that was really just to fight a common enemy. They didn't do it because they suddenly love humans. Back to Heart, while he did develop, it's not a development that I'm a fan of. He basically learns the importance of human heart. Except, he already knew the importance of heart. Sure, maybe not human heart, but like, come on. The dude's name is fucking Heart. This is the guy whose gimmick was deeply caring for each Roidmude and genuinely felt saddened by each of their deaths. It would have been better for the film to have him come to expand his caring nature to humans as well, instead of telling him, well, you love humans, but you have to understand why they're strong. The main villain is also someone I have issues with. Roidmu 5886 is the combination of the fragmented data of all 108 Roidmudes, and he wants a new wife. Yeah, that's it. He's seriously bland. The only thing I remembered about this dude was that 5886 is all the numbers from 1 to 108 added together. It said that that's the most memorable part about him. At least the story's somewhat decent. I mean, yeah, they did have this weird buddy cop thing with Heart and Oda, but it wasn't terrible, just unnecessary. The rest of the story is pretty standard, but at least the interactions between the Roidmu trio make it fun to watch. So yeah, an average film that, ironically, doesn't feel like any heart was put into it. Sure, there were some impactful moments and the pacing is fine, but it feels like the film tried to make Heart develop, even if it meant making him go through an arc that doesn't make much sense for the dude, instead of telling a compelling story with him. Well, another short film, and this time it's Gaim's first film in this list.
夢を見ていたこの手で作り変える
Gaim Gaiden Baron is the worst Gaim film, but that doesn't mean it's terrible. While we did get an expansion of Kaito's characters, I found it incredibly odd that the show didn't simply state this in the actual TV show. We learned that his lust for strength stems from Yggdrasil basically destroying his father's factory, which eventually led to both of his parents committing suicide and making him despise his weakness to do anything to help them. Sure, it's nice that we learn what motivated his desire for strength, but did it really have to be in a film released after the show had already concluded? However, the biggest issue about this film is that it's not really focused on Kaito. Sure, he may have gotten some reveals about his past and is the titular character, but this film focuses on a complete random character and his problems instead. Shapul is a rich kid who just so happens to look exactly like Kaito. After some shenanigans, it turns out that Shapul ran away from home because he believes his father will kill him, but Kaito teaches Shapul to face his problems head on. The villain of the film is also more connected with Shapul's issues instead of Kaito's. Alfred is Shapul's butler who wants power, and yeah, also bland and lame. I mean, I like the details we learned about Kaito in this film, and the overall plot moves along fine, and had some great comedy moments, but it's really just dragged down by how much it focuses on a completely random character instead of Kaito. Also, the villain being a complete nobody, but whatever. It's basically a given that most Kamen Rider movie villains suck. Another Gaim film. Is Gaim going to be the Deno of this part? Yeah, for as surprisingly goofy the film concept is, Great Soccer Battle isn't that bad. Sure, the concept of Gaim but soccer was overall pointless in the grand scheme of things, but at least it had some entertaining moments. Kota doesn't do much except be the audience surrogate to learn more about this new soccer world. Sure, he does prove that he fights for everyone, but he's already shown that in episodes prior, so what's the point in repeating it again? All the other characters are just lackluster, so there's really not much else I can say about them, other than that they at least move the plot along at a decent pace. Well, all the other characters with the exception of the movie's main side character, Lapis. He's an overlord that created this soccer world, and he hates humans, believing they're the same as overlords in that they only want power to fight against each other. But after seeing Kota use his powers to save others, he decides that he was wrong and helps Kota and the others defeat the villain of this film. Yeah, he's the only reason why Kota spouted that "not all humans that want power are bad" speech. Sure, he developed over the course of the film, and I liked it. But it just felt pointless since once again, we already know that Kota wants power to protect his friends. You don't have to keep beating it into our head. Finally, we get to the villain of this film, Kogain. He was born from an artificial golden fruit that the overlords created, and drives everyone to start killing each other because it would help fertilize the artificial golden fruit inside of him? Okay. All he cares about is being the ultimate being of the universe, so standard Rider movie villain motivation. There are also some small issues I have with his backstory and power set, but they're pretty minor in the grand scheme of things, so let's just say it's me overanalyzing Kamen Rider too deeply again. So yeah, while this was a nice film, my main issue is that it's a film that doesn't really enhance the experience of Gaim at all. Oh, we get to see Kota stand up against evil and say he fights for his friends for like the 4th time. Yeah, real thrilling. This film doesn't develop the story of the characters of the TV show in any meaningful way. At least there were some standout moments, such as that final transformation scene. However, what drags it down to a 4 out of 10 is the characters of Lapis and Kogain. If they were a bit better, this would probably be one of the most average films in Kamen Rider. Well, it's been a while since we've had a movie war film in this list, so let's talk about one now, shall we? Movie Warcore is a pretty split bag in my opinion. I love Message for Skull, I hate Nobunaga's Desire, and I find the movie Warcore section below average. So let's start off with Message for Skull. Honestly, the only real issue I have about this part is the context behind it, mainly with Ayumi using the memory guy memory to have Akiko watch the story of Sokichi's first transformation into Skull. Plus, having Akiko learn that Kamen Riders endure tragedy support others is a bit redundant, but other than that, it's pretty great. The expansion of Sokichi was pretty great. It's nice finally being able to see more of the badass himself, and we did get a closer look at his character. He's essentially a Showa Rider, becoming a monster to fight the Dopons, forced to work alone after killing his best friend, and forced to never see his daughter again out of kindness. Though I will note that him refusing the skull memory a bit weird, but honestly, it's not that big of an issue. Plus, I love the overall story. Sure, it was just a Dopon case, but it had a good mystery vibe, and I really did like the villain, Matsui. He had a noble cause, taking the Dopont memory because he wanted to help Melissa, but due to the corruption of the Gaia memory, he's eventually forced to be put down by Sokichi. It's pretty tragic. But now we get to the other section, Nobunaga's Desire. Let me just say this simply, this part is the complete mess. It's probably because the main writer of this part was Inoue and not Kobayashi, which leads to a lot of awkward characterization, weird story beats, and contradiction with the TV series. The biggest example of this is the mention of the Greed Gil, the one behind creating the dinosaur yummies, except we never see him in the series proper. Like I hinted before, I find Eiichi's characterization a bit odd. Sure, it's only a minor thing, but I find that he's basically turned into a hero that helps everyone no matter what. I mean, yeah, he helps people, but not by literally doing everything for them, but rather teaching them to stand up on their own. He gives away money to people fully knowing that they're just leeching off of him, but he doesn't mind. Didn't one two-parter of O's deal with this exact issue of giving people money, even if it's for a good cause? Also, wouldn't he have been a bit more cautious of giving random people money, given that his past involves being held for ransom, which was then twisted to have people support his father? Anyway, that's just a bit of a tangent. And to reiterate, I'm not saying Eiichi's character was bad in this film, just different from his usual self, which felt odd. Now let's talk about the titular character, Nobunaga. He was revived in the modern world by Kogami because they both like Desire. Yeah, that's the only reason why he got revived. Anyways, he then spends most of his time wandering around, with the only thing he can remember being his own name. He meets with Eiji, they become friends, and then he becomes the president of the company because he read a lot of books. Oh, is that too fast for you? Well, this part doesn't care about pacing, so why should I? Anyways, his main plan is to conquer the world, starting with Japan by obtaining the Hatsuhana, Nita, and Narashiba. However, his body begins to break down and he starts to lose his memories again, but Eiichi tells him that life is fun already, so he shouldn't focus too much on Desire. Then he dies. Yeah, the whole plot revolving around Nobunaga really makes this part suffer. Nobunaga is a bland character, only wanting to conquer Japan because that's what the real Nobunaga was like, or something. Sure, he did learn that too much desire is bad, but the path for that development was paved with boring scenes. I also find it odd that they tell Nobunaga that too much desire is bad, but never tell Eiichi that not having any desire is also bad. And lastly, the core portion of this film is honestly forgettable. Core is born out of nowhere thanks to the memory Gaia memory and black core medals, don't even ask where those came from. Eiji, Shotaro, and Velop team up, they defeat Core, the end. So yeah, overall, a very mixed bag. Message for Skull was great for the expansion of Tsukichi and telling a great story in general. Nobunaga's Desire was bad because of how messy and boring the plot was, and the core portion just felt way too rushed. This won't be the only time a movie war has one really good section and one really bad one. I guess this movie was missing its ace. Alright, I'll stop with the bad puns. Yeah, Missing Ace is quite the generic film. How many times have I said that already? Since this is a Heisei Inoue film, this is an alternate universe film where Kanzaki ends up stealing Hajime. I liked Kanzaki and Mutsuki in this film since we spent a good amount of time with them adjusting to life not being a writer and how their experiences of being a writer affected them. For Kanzaki, he's become a garbage man but yearned for those days of being a writer since he was able to help and protect others and regrets having to steal Hajime. Mutsuki wants to forget about his time as being a writer since he spent most of the time under the Spider Undead's control, but it's clear that no matter how much he tries to shut it out, he still can't get the thought of being a writer again out of his head. It's then unfortunate that after both of these characters get their powers back, they fall into the standard goody two-shoes hero that does their best. Now, you may be asking about Tachibana and Hajime, and well, they're kinda disappointing. Tachibana has become the new head of board, and that's it. Hajime only shows up at the last act of the film, and that's also it. I wish that either of these characters did more, since they honestly felt wasted. Now, while the other side characters have some focus, mainly showcasing how much they've changed since Hajime's sealing, the only character I really want to focus on is Amane. After Hajime's sealing, she's basically become a brat, believing that everyone important to her has abandoned her to pursue their own things. She then eventually changes out of being a brat after Hajime talks to her. Her development was alright, but it was boring, not helped by her being, for no reason, the only method to open the monolith, which are why the villains are after her. Speaking of villains, they're all boring. Shin and Natsumi are honestly just there to waste screen time. Both barely have any characterization before they're killed off. Junichi is at least slightly better than both of them, only because he actually has some screen time. He's the albino Joker, and his main plan is to gain the monolith's power because he wants power. Well, I said he was only slightly better. Sure, he has a personality of being unhinged, but that barely makes up for how cliched his character is. With the story, it just felt oddly slow and boring. I mean, the pacing's fine and I wasn't that bored. Maybe it's because the film tried to juggle two stories at once, the plot with the new writers and returning writers, and the plot focusing on how Amane and the others have changed over 4 years. Sure, the story was well written and didn't have any gaping plot holes, but I think them trying to juggle both plots at the same time just led to a disorientating narrative. I can't really explain it that well. Something about this film just felt bland, lifeless, and charmless. Overall, Missing Ace has a decent story, but something about it I just can't explain that makes it bad. Kanzaki and Mutsuki were interesting at the start, but they quickly fell back into their standard characters. Hajime, Tachibana, and the other side characters basically did nothing, and the subplot with Mane didn't really entice me that much. Plus the villains were terrible, with none of them really having a character. Well, at least there were some good emotional moments, especially the scenes with Kanzaki and Hajime. Well, it's time for Gaim film number 3-ish. Is the Fateful Sengoku movie battle a Gaim film or a Wizard film? Doesn't matter. Funny enough, I think Gaim section is what drags this movie down, but honestly, Wizard's portion isn't that much better. It mainly deals with Haruto and the effect that Koyomi's death had on him. Sure, this sounds like a good idea on paper, but all that really happens is Haruto talking about how much Koyomi meant to him, which has been something that's been covered enough in the TV series, so it feels like it's treading old ground. Well, it could be worse. At least it doesn't blatantly repeat character developments, unlike Gaim's part, where the major portion of the runtime is Koto learning to use his powers to protect others, which is something both he and we should already know at this point. There are also other characters that get focused, but honestly, they really aren't worth mentioning. Wizard's portion pretty much exclusively focuses on Haruto, while Gaim more focuses on Koto learning to use his powers for others. Anyways, with their stories, I've already mentioned that Wizard's portion deals with Haruto dealing with the loss of Koyomi. Meanwhile, Gaim deals with Kota, Kaito, and the others being transported to the alternate world of the Bujin Riders. So yeah, you can tell that Wizard's portion is arguably the more interesting of the two, which is partly the reason why it's better. Though as a trade-off, Wizard's portion has a lot more story issues that I found, while Gaim's section has slow pacing and kind of a slog to get through. Now with the villains, they're both pretty bad. Even though Oga was just a standard Phantom of the Week, I felt like he was the better villain of the two since he wasn't shrouded in mystery, unlike Bujin Gaim. Bujin Gaim wants to rule over the world and he summons Kaito, Kota, and Mitsuzane to his world and kills the other Bujin Riders and combines himself with a big tree that holds all the Riders' power and also needs might to complete his domination of the world or something. Okay, why? Overall, this would be an average movie, but it suffered from a weak and boring Gaim portion, mediocre but repetitive Wizard portion, and terrible villains that were generic, bland, and had zero explanation for their power sets. Well, this movie will probably shock you with how high up it is. Yeah, there's pretty much one reason alone why Stronger's movie, or the theatrical version of episode 7, ranks this high. It actually has charm to it. Oh sure, the plot's stupid as hell, with Black Satan taking over a restaurant just to turn people into slaves, but that wasn't as big as an issue. Shigeru really does bring a lot to make this film enjoyable. His swagger and demeanor led to a lot of enjoyable moments, and I really liked his dynamic with Yuriko in this film. And there were some nice moments of tension, with Shigeru supposedly being mind controlled while Yuriko stuck in a trap. But for as enjoyable as this movie was, I can't really rank it any higher, mainly because there was no plot, no sense of grandeur, and it had some generic villains. Speaking of shocking movie placements, yeah, I find Heisei Generations a disappointment. Surprising since this movie probably ranks a bit higher for most people. The plot's fine, the pacing's alright, and the overall enjoyability was fine. However, my main issue with this film can be summed up into 3 categories: terrible handling of the characters, terrible villains, and story issues. Let's start off with the least egregious of the 3, the story issues. Now, you can probably tell I nitpick way too much when I watch Rider stuff, and yeah, that's exactly what I did for this film. They're very small issues in the grand scheme of things, but they did ruin my immersion in this film. Things such as why exactly our movie exclusive character Toga was targeted, Takeru getting his powers back, how the villains were able to escape from the game world, the Ghost Riders being able to take down the Bucksters, and more. Next issues, the villains. They're all pretty bland and forgettable. The 3 lackeys, Soji, Kazushige, and Ageha, all have one trait defining them: strong, smug, girl fighter. Be honest, did any of you actually know their names by heart? Our main villain is Dr. I mean Michiko Zaisen. Yeah, Michiko Zaisen. Yeah, other than promotional reasons, there was no reason for Michiko to disguise himself as Dr. Pac-Man. The whole who is Dr. Pac-Man mystery just felt forced as all hell. Anyways, his plan is to become the ultimate being because he wants to save people from an illness because it's for the greater good. To achieve this, he releases a virus to locate a person with a certain bugster virus strain, but will infect anyone else with a deadly virus instead that will eventually kill them. To save people my ass, Duke could have easily just programmed the virus to solely be used for tracking. So yeah, he's pretty bland and underdeveloped. Finally, handling of the characters. Good lord, did the writers screw this up. Any of the characters beside Takeru and Emu did nothing. Ghost side characters were especially egregious since they all just got reduced to being a part of Takeru's fan club. The Legend Riders, while nice to see them again, really felt underutilized, and Togo just felt completely unnecessary. He's the most important character in this film, but we hardly know anything about his character and motivation. All we know is that he loves programming video games, but is bashful towards others. But after the events of the film, he starts warming up to others. With Takeru, they really didn't utilize him at all. He was basically just his standard self. Which is funny because I consider him the best character of the film. Yeah, it's because they didn't try to screw up his character. Unlike Emu, good lord, what did they do with him? To know, I like that they try to challenge him in this film, but it just comes off as extremely childish and petty. To best present why I found this whole thing dumb and stupid, I'll basically sum up the entire development Emu had. After Togo is captured by the villains, Emu laments despite curing everyone of the Pac-Man virus, which was around 100,000 lives, he couldn't save Togo, and believes he's a worse doctor than both Hiro and Taiga because they were able to save Makoto and Awan. He then doubts himself as a doctor, but after Poppy reminds him that he became a doctor to save others, he gets motivated to fight again. Do you see why I find this whole thing stupid? And it sucks, because this is the only thing Emu gets in this film. He comes off as a child that needs to be perfect without flaws. Wah, I couldn't save one person even though I saved 100,000 lives. Wah, I'm a worse doctor than most Hiro and Taiga. Wah. I want to reiterate this again. I do not find this a bad film. I find this an average film with some negative things. The overall plot is fine, the pacing is good, the action's amazing, and I love seeing all the Legend Riders return, but some small story details, bad villains, and terrible character handling just bring it down. I know I make it sound like I hate this movie for what it did to the characters, but honestly, I'm just more disappointed in it. Alright, now it's time for the Build fanbase to hate me even more. Yes, I find New World Cross the best Build movie. I know people hate it for basically undoing everything the character sacrificed in the final arc, and while I agree it's bad, it's not that bad as everyone makes it out to be. However, even though I call this the best Build movie, it still isn't even ranking a 5 out of 10, so what's bad about it? Well, I'm glad you asked, hypothetical viewer, but let's begin with a plot summary. After the creation of the New World, Evolto's brother, Kilbus, appears, and after some shenanigans, everyone's memory of the old world comes back, and Evolto's revived. He teams up with Ryuga to kill Kilbus, they succeed, and then Evolto fucks off to space or something. Alright, with that out of the way, let's talk about the decent things in this film. Yeah, other than the action and seeing all the characters interact with each other, there's really not much else I found good in this film. First off, Ryuga. Here's the thing about him in this movie, while I did like him, all the film really does is just reinforce how far he's come as a person, fighting for others instead of himself. Wow, how heroic. He doesn't grow, get challenged, or do anything really that's striking in this film. The best he does is, well, I was bad in the past, but now I'm good. Second, Evolto. Ooh, I really am angering the fanbase, aren't I? Yeah, I know that most people hate his portrayal in the movie because he basically acts like a completely different character, but honestly, I don't find that as bad. Sure, his characterization is pretty odd, but he does bring some charm to the film, so he's not that bad. He's a mediocre part of the movie, if that soothes your soul. Let's talk about villains now. No, I'm definitely not trying to distract you from my previous comments, trust me. While Kilbus is honestly a generic villain that wants to destroy the universe because I love destruction, I find he's probably the best Build movie villain since he brings a lot of life to his character. Too bad it doesn't make up for how bland he is. Plus the plot is decently paced, with some cool looking shots and probably one of the hypest movie songs. Cross is legit a good banger. But now it's time to talk about the worst aspects of the film, plot retcons and Yui. Even though they're two separate things, the biggest issues of both are linked to each other, so I'll talk about them together for now. Yui was originally kidnapped by Evolto after Ryuga failed to save her because he was too busy fighting. She was tortured and killed, resulting in a wasp bottle, but revived in the New World. She initially hates Ryuga for abandoning her, but she falls for him after realizing he's not the same person he was before. You can see my issue, right? Other than serving as a love interest and reflecting how far Ryuga's developed, she serves no other purpose. Everything about her own character is either briefly touched upon or forgotten after being mentioned. Now, here's where the plot retcon issues come into play. You know how I mentioned that Ryuga failed to save Yui and thus was killed to create a wasp bottle? Well, Ryuga only neglected to save her because he was only fighting for himself at the time, not for others. Now, from that statement, we can confidently place Yui's abduction somewhere in between episodes 10 and 14, because unless Ryuga learned nothing after the events of Heisei Generation's final, he learned to fight for others at the end of that film. Sure, you can technically argue that Ryugo was a dumbass that continued to fight for himself well into the early 30s, but I highly doubt that. Now, because of this, we can conclude that Yveltal has known about the lost bottles and has had one in his possession since at least episode 14. You could also argue that Yui was kept alive until the early 30s, but I highly doubt that Yveltal tortured her for months on end. Yeah, unless Yveltal is the biggest dumbass to exist, there is no way he would have just had multiple lost bottles laying around doing nothing for months and not actively trying to utilize them. Other small plot issues include how Killbus even snuck himself onto the white Pandora panel, how he managed to create another Pandora's box out of thin air, and why in the world Sento would he create the spider transformation device even though he literally states Kamen Rider shouldn't be needed in this world, not even a minute later after showing it to Ryuga. Overall, while this film was average with a fine pacing and cool shots, it's just dragged down by Killbus being boring, Ryuga doing nothing other than look how far I've come, the plot retcons, and Yui's entire deal. Like Be the One, this film is fine as a standalone film, but it's really only an issue if you start applying what we learned in this film to the overall narrative of Build. Man, 2 long rants. I really gotta stop talking about the negative things and focus on the good more. Well, I know I won't be talking about this film much. Yes, Gaim film number 4, and it's Gaim Gaiden Zangetsu. No, not Zangetsu Gaim Gaiden, that's different. While it wasn't decent exploration about Takatora's past, it was overall just repetitive. The main thing we learn about Takatora in this film is that he doesn't have the guts to execute Project Arc, which is something we already knew, and he wants to go back to the past where everything was much more peaceful. Honestly, I would have liked it had this been an origin story on Takatora, watching him first transform into Zangetsu and learning what shaped his character at the beginning of the series. At least the villain is pretty decent. Toko was Takatora's father's maid, and she seemed to have a nice relationship with Takatora. However, she reveals herself to be Kamen Rider Idun, wanting revenge against the Kurishima family for torturing her, as she was tortured by Takatora's father as a child. She had a decent motivation, and I liked her relationship with Takatora, but her characterization is quite bland. Oh yeah, plot. Well, not much I can say about it. The film's only 30 minutes long, so there really aren't any pacing issues. There aren't any big story issues either, and it's kinda like a fun, mindless story. Okay, fun might be stretching it, more like a regular episode of Gaim. However, there is one reason why this movie is still only a 4 out of 10 and not a 5 out of 10, and that's all the new plot reveals this movie includes. So you know how I mentioned that Toko wanted revenge against the Kurishima family for torturing her? Well, it turns out she wasn't the only one. Takatora's father had been running experiments on children to turn them into Yggdrasil members, and it turns out that Ryoma is also one of these Yggdrasil children. Does it expand the world of Gaim? Yes. Does it explain anything from the TV series? No. Did this plot point even matter or explain anything in the overall narrative of Gaim? No. So why did this film even bother including these things that don't matter if it just meant taking away more time from developing Takatora? Other than that, this film's fine. Decent expansion on Takatora, decent film, and a decent story. These last 4 movies are all ranked 5 out of 10 now, and the first one is another Gaim film. Go figure. Yeah, Gaim Gaiden Do only ranks above Gaim Gaiden Zangetsu since it doesn't introduce that many things out of left field. Other than that, they're pretty much on par in terms of quality. On the topic of Ryoma, we really don't learn much about him in this film that hasn't already been shown in the TV series. Yes, it was nice to see how his relationship with Takatora was in the beginning, but the film just basically tells the audience that Ryoma's always disliked how Takatora wanted to use power for others and not just himself, and that Takatora was the only one who saw Ryoma's potential, which are both things the TV show has already covered. We also do get some backstory on the new Genesis writers, mainly that Yoka was a spy and Sid was just some random thug, both of them eventually getting hired by Ryoma. Finally, the villain, Kugai. He's pretty bland as a character, but he does have an interesting backstory. He was originally the first one to use the lock seed, but the experiment ended up vaporizing his body, setting his spirit free. His motivation is to become god of the world, and that's it. Yeah, other than how generic his goal is and an unexplained mystery of how he even got his powers, he's overall just generic. Alright, well, that's all I can really say about this film. Basically just a slightly better Gaim Gaiden Zangetsu. Bear with me for a minute. I'm just gonna let the entirety of this film's intro play out. Real talk, I love that intro. Too bad it's not winning any brownie points because of it. Back on topic, I find Hibiki and the Seven Senki the definition of an average Rider movie. Since this isn't a New Heisei film, this takes place in an alternate universe, though unlike the other films, this does not serve as an alternate conclusion for Hibiki. Most of the plot takes place back in the past, and since the present plot doesn't really matter too much, I won't be talking about it. Alright, summary time. In the Sengoku era, a village is forced to sacrifice a girl every year to the Makamo known as Orochi. Asumu's ancestor, who's also called Asumu, decides to put a stop to Orochi and gathers 7 Onis: Kabuki, Ibuki, Todoroki, Tooki, Kiremeki, Nishiki, and Habataki. However, it turns out Kabuki is a traitor, with Hibiki eventually revealing himself and taking down Kabuki. With that, Hibiki teams up with the other Oni, and then the story ends abruptly, cutting forward to the present where present Osamu helps the present Hibiki kill off Orochi. With that out of the way, let's talk about the characters first. Unfortunately, pretty much all of them, save for Kabuki, are all pretty one note. Osamu hated Hibiki because he believed he killed his brother Takeshi. Hibiki regrets not being able to save Takeshi. Toki was a Buddhist, Nishiki was a smug thief, Kiremeki is wild, Ibuki is a daimyo, and Habataki is a family man. Todoroki is the only one that pretty much remains the same as his present counterpart, but even he's dumbed down, just being the new guy who looks up to everyone. And Kabuki, you know what, I'll talk about him later. Let's talk about the plot for now. There are some small issues I have with the story, but overall it's fine. However, there is one major problem that leads me to denoting it as an average movie instead of a good movie. That is the fact that this movie tries to juggle 2 plots at the same time. I've already mentioned the plot about gathering Oni in a group to defeat Orochi, but there was also a subplot about the racism towards Oni by humans. Sure, I like the subplot and the scenes that involve dealing with that topic, but unfortunately I just found it ultimately detracted from the more interesting plot of gathering Oni to fight Orochi. Plus, it basically forced Kabuki to be a twist villain to neatly resolve that subplot, despite the fact that this movie already had a main villain in the form of Orochi. Honestly, this film would have been better had they either stuck with just the Oni versus Orochi plot, or Humans Hate Oni plot, so the film wouldn't get muddied by trying to juggle the two. Back to the topic of Kabuki, he's a very special character. You know why? Because he's actually a good movie writer villain. He first comes off as a crass man who's driven by profit, but he does have a heart of gold. But when the betrayal is revealed, he reveals his plan to become a Makamo to destroy humanity. Why? Well, it's because he got fed up with humans constantly treating him like shit, always being ignored and despised despite all the help he's given them. Even after his betrayal, he still has a soft spot for Asumu, showing there's more than just a man filled with hatred towards humans. Though unfortunately, after he is revealed as a villain, he doesn't get as nearly as much focus as I would have liked, and like I said before, I find his status as a villain unnecessary since Orochi was already a main villain. To repeat myself, this film is the definition of an average movie. Most of the characters are one note, but they do at least have some charm to them. Kabuki is a good movie villain, but I just found him an unnecessary addition. The overall plot's fine, but it's certainly held back by juggling 2 plots at once. Man, it only took 60 movies, but we finally got an average movie. I know I said Gaimgaiden Duke was a 5 out of 10, but that film's a low 5 out of 10, if that makes any sense. Man, I really can't stop talking about Gaim this part, can I? Well, my favorite Gaim film is indeed Gaimgaiden Knuckle, unless you want to count movie War Full Throttle. Similar to Gaimgaiden Zangetsu, Duke, and Baron, this movie serves to expand Zack and learn about his past, but unlike the other films, this one actually develops him properly. We do learn how Team Baron formed, but the more interesting part is the growth that Zack undergoes, namely learning to face his weakness head on. Sure, it's not much, but it's at least something, given how underutilized he was in the main series. Shura, our main antagonist, is kinda meh. He wants to carry on Kaito's will of creating a world for the strong only, and that's about it. And you already know how I feel about the plot. It's fine, with no pacing issues or major plot issues. So yeah, that's about it for Gaim movies. Knuckle was a nice short story that focused on Zack. Kinda odd that all the movies Gaim had are pretty lackluster despite how good the TV series was. Oh well. Once again, we are ending this part with another important movie for the Rider franchise. Yes, the first movie war film, which is just called Movie War 2010, is probably the definition of a mixed bag. One part was awful, while the other part was completely amazing, and the last part also sucked. Let's start with the worst part, Final Chapter. This entire portion was pretty disappointing, pretty much scrapping the plot threads left by Decade's final episode and just going in a completely new direction. While there's nothing wrong with that, it's just that this new direction wasn't great at all. For some reason, Tsukasa decides to kill all the other Kamen Riders, with Daiki, Natsumi, and Yusuke, don't even ask why he's sane again, eventually deciding to stop him. They kill him, but Tsukasa reveals this was all part of his plan before dying. Wataru explains that Tsukasa's battles with the other riders will somehow allow memories of each rider to last in people's memories, thus bringing all their worlds back. Decade has no storyline, then everyone remembers Tsukasa through a picture and he's magically back. Some stuff later and bam, evil's defeated. Yeah, you could probably tell that this movie didn't exactly have the clearest of directions. Made worse that this film also shoehorned a random subplot with Yuriko and how no one cares about her to try and have some connection with Tsukasa. Too bad this film apparently just forgets that Yuriko had Shigeru and the two of them were always considered a duo. Also, the conclusion of that subplot was a mess. Oh, thanks to Tsukasa doing nothing, I found the place where I belong, somehow. Final chapter was just a giant mess, throwing around half-baked ideas into a giant mixing bowl to try and come up with some sensible conclusion for Decade. Well, given the development that this part went through, it's understandable why this part would turn out so badly, but that doesn't excuse its awful quality. Okay, with that out of the way, let's talk about probably the best portion to ever exist in a movie war, Begins Night. Honestly, if Begins Night was its own movie, it would probably be in the top 5. It's a fantastic origin story for both Shotaro and Philip. Despite being exclusive to the movie, not excluding Message for Skull, Sokichi is a fantastic character who was brilliantly written despite having such little screen time. We get to know all of these characters better, and this knowledge helps us understand them in the present. We see the stark contrast between their past and present selves. Shotaro is a lot more hot-headed while Philip is a lot more apathetic. We understand that Sokichi's death and the resulting guilt drives Shotaro to be better and causes him to refuse putting on his mentor's hat, as well as why he looks up to Sokichi so much. We learn why Philip fears Fang, why he desires to become more independent, and why he wants to stick with Shotaro. Hell, we even see some development for Shotaro in the present, being the first time where he's not relying on Sokichi's shadow to guide him, but instead working to become his own detective with his own ideals, symbolized by him standing against the ghost of Sokichi. An okay origin story is an origin story that only serves to tell a story and nothing more. A great origin story is a story that helps define the characters we love more and plays an impactful role in their development, which is exactly what Begins Night does. And the storytelling is honestly tight, constantly moving at a good pace. No scene really feels like padding or bloated with information. Honestly, the only real disappointment I have with this film is the villain, the dummy Dopant, being somewhat bland, but he really isn't the main focus of this film. And yeah, I could talk about the movie War 2010 portion where Decade and Double team up, but honestly all you really have to know is that it's the same quality as Final Chapter. Overall, Decade Final Chapter and Movie War 2010 are both messy, not really having any fleshed out ideas nor good developments for the cast, resulting in poor stories. However, Begins Night greatly makes up for it, serving as a great origin story for Shotaro and Philip, and paving the way for Shotaro's development in the present. Well, that's 3 parts done. One last one to go through. On how I can really only call 17 movies better than average.